Good evening. This is Tom Tresser, public defender, civic educator, co-founder of the CivicLab in Chicago. The CivicLab is a do tank dedicated to tool building, training, education, research, and public education through meetings and workshops, all about accelerating and deepening work in government accountability, civic engagement, and social justice. You can say our mantra is educate, fabricate, replicate, activate, liberate, and repeat. We are the authors and originators of the TIF Illumination Project that's been looking at tax increment financing, those nasty beasts running amok all over America through the TIF Illumination Project. We are also the authors of Chicago is Not Broke, Funding the City You Deserve. And that book is available at wearenotbroke.org. Now, this show is fairly new, and what we're about is interviewing one person, a social justice warrior, every week, and taking the perspective when we talk to our guests that they're kind of a superhero. I know superheroes are big in our culture now. I grew up with Marvel comics myself, and I remember the first Spider-Man, the first X-Men, and I'm betraying my age here. But truthfully, the people who are working often with very little resources and with sometimes a lot of adverse circumstances, working on behalf of the greater good, remedying social injustice, working to fight for equity. I regard those folks as real heroes. And so each week we endeavor to bring one of those folk to you via our show. Now, tonight we're trying something new. We have a guest standing by remotely. Our special guest is Ellen Brown. Now, Ellen is a lawyer, an educator, an activist, and a bit of what I would call a provocateur. So Ellen is the author of this book, The Public Bank Solution, From Austerity to Prosperity. And so she has become the go-to person in America for public banking. And she will explain this institution to us about, what is a public bank. It may be a new concept for many of our viewers, but it's one of the features featured in our book, Chicago is Not Broke, Funding the City We Deserve. And I learned really about this concept from reading her work and following her colleagues around the country who are working to bring this institution to life. I think I hear you. Oh,
hi.
I see you there, Ellen.
Sorry, I got messed up on there.
All right. So if I see you, I think our viewers at home can see you.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. So as I was saying in our introduction, the CivicLab show is about introducing new people to our viewers who I consider to be social justice superheroes. All right? These are people who labor, for the common good, often with very little resources, against great adversaries,
Like Wall Street.
and often their labors are done, without a lot of love from the general public, but it's the general public that benefits. And in that spirit, we bring in Ellen Brown, and I believe you're now in California. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Where in California are you?
Los Angeles, so I'm just north of the valley in Santa Clarita.
Okay. Hopefully, no fires are coming to you.
Not now, no. We did get the fires got very close quite recently.
Yeah. So we're reading about that here in Chicago. It's very alarming. So hopefully everything
Yeah.
is you're good and safe. So we're this is our first sort of remote interview. So thank you so much for joining us. So Ellen Brown, the way I came to you, Ellen, is through your work in public banking. But Ellen is a lawyer, an activist, an educator, and I would say something of a provocateur for raising these, I would say, somewhat very serious issues and helping us unpack them around the world of finance and kind of how governments work. And it takes an educator to help us walk through that. She's the author of the book A Public Bank Solution. So, in the spirit of our superhero frame, would you tell us your origin story? What brought you? What's your journey to this place?
Okay, so I'm an attorney by profession, but I really always wanted to be a writer. So one of the many things I had researched was the Federal Reserve, but I didn't really have a hook, a way to get in until I discovered that the Wizard of Oz was written as a monetary allegory in the 1890s. And so
Whoa, back
that
up. What does that mean?
well, it was the first ever march on Washington in 1894.
Okay.
Was it was Coxey's army seeking a return to Abraham Lincoln's greenback system. Abraham Lincoln had avoided a massive debt to British bankers during the Civil War by just issuing the money. So he basically doubled the money supply by issuing greenbacks or paper money.
Okay.
And yeah, and so that worked brilliantly well. I mean, the North won the war. We didn't go heavily into debt, and that new money funded all sorts of development after the war, including building the Transcontinental Railroad, which tied the country together. So it was a very productive period. But then Lincoln, of course, was assassinated, and the greenbacks were recalled, and there was the bankers actually pushed to get silver demonetized. So gold was the only reserve, acceptable reserve
Okay.
in the banks. And so this radically shrunk the money supply, which created a depression. And so the farmers were suffering. They were getting foreclosed on, and the workers were out of work. So they were marching to Washington, D.C. in an effort to get Washington to go back to issuing paper money in the same way that Lincoln did, and the same way that the American colonists did. And this was the Wizard of Oz, is like these four beings.
I had no idea.
Oz, yeah. And Dorothy was patterned after Mary Ellen Lease, who was this firebrand greenback leader. She was a Kansas farmer who had lost her farm to foreclosure, and she had gone to law school and in her reading in her spare time while she was raising these four kids. And anyway, the Scarecrow then was the farmers, and the Tin Man was the workers, and that what they were seeking was to expand the money supply. And when that failed, then William Jennings Bryan was the populist leader. He championed a return to silver as a monetary base, but still the idea was for the government to issue the paper money backed by silver, not that the banks would. And he actually, of course, he lost both elections that he ran in, but that was the closest we got to a third party ever getting elected. So it was a quite, it made the news, certainly all this activity. And yeah.
And this inspired you to write
that was
your own?
my first book, Web of Debt. On this, I've written 13 books. My first 10 books.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, I was a lawyer, but and my ex-husband was a lawyer in Los Angeles, but he was under a whole lot of pressure, and he didn't want to work. He did, anyway, he decided he wanted to take a job with the Foreign Service, with USAID, which we did. So we went abroad for 11 years, and I got to raise kids and write books. So that was when I wrote these first 10 books on health and the politics of health. And I realized at some point, it was on alternative healthcare, and I realized at some point that if you wanted to fix the healthcare problem, you really had to fix the banking problem, because it was one big cartel, the banks and the
Okay.
yeah.
So we're starting to see a theme here.
Yeah. So then in 2008, so that book was published in 2007, and in 2008, when we had the banking crisis, I knew that North Dakota was the only state that had its own state-owned bank. So I was watching it, and it turned out to be the only state that escaped the credit crisis.
So so your journey started out. You were a lawyer and you got interested in healthcare, but your travels abroad exposed you to alternative medicine that further piqued your interest, that you wanted to say, well, why can't we do those practices here? Something like that?
Being abroad was very educational, but it wasn't for that. I was a lawyer, but I was a sickly lawyer. so I was always interested in alternatives, and I'd explored a lot of them. And I collaborated with those 10 books. I collaborated 4 of them with a friend who was a pharmacist and had every form of alternative license. So she was a great person to collaborate with. And then I collaborated with a dentist. But the last of those books was about a cancer therapist in Tijuana who had been kidnapped by the FBI, basically taken to Brownsville, Texas, tried for alleged fraud of saying he had a high rate of success with cancer, which he actually did. And I spent many years. I spent like 7 years on that whole case. I spent many years in jail with him, interviewing him.
Wow.
Well, he was in jail for 4 years and interviewing his patients, and he really did have and he was a great conspiracy theorist. So that's where I got, that's where I saw behind everything, and
starting to question some sacred cows, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this is so maybe we can say one of your superpowers is having X-ray vision, to see beyond things, to see through things.
Peeling back the curtain, which is a Wizard of Oz thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So to keep that image going. So as you say, you started to wonder about the banking system. So what was the thing that really made you mad or angry or curious, that sort of really sent you off to looking at what was happening in North Dakota?
Well, we had the crisis, and I'd been writing about that the government should be issuing the money, not well. The basic theme of Web of Debt was that banks, not governments, actually issue our money. That they issue it as loans.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was a conspiracy. This is considered conspiracy theory, but. Now, in 2014, the Bank of England came out and said in their quarterly report, I think because they were getting so much pushback from money reformers like Positive Money in England, that they said, contrary to popular belief, banks are not merely intermediaries taking in money and lending it out again. They actually create money when they make loans. And in fact, said the Bank of England, they create 97% of the money supply in this way. So they create money as loans. They charge interest, so they don't create the interest. So there's always more money owed back than was created in the original loan. And this is what's responsible for our booms and busts, or what's called the business cycle. But it's not really a natural thing. It's something that could be fixed if we fix the money.
So
the money system.
I've got a few. Here's something called Empire of Debt. The Rise of an Epic Financial Crisis by Bill Bonner and Addison Wiggin. Then we have Break Up the Banks by David Sheriff. Then we have Pigs at the Trough, How Corporate Greed and Political Corruption Are Undermining America by Arianna Huffington. Then we have Reckless Endangerment by New York Times reporter or former New York Times reporter Gretchen Morgenstern and Joshua Rosner. How outsized ambition, greed, and corruption created the worst financial crisis of our time. So it sounds like you're a critique of the what we would call the financial system here, or commercial banking. You've got a critical view. Is that fair?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I would agree with all those. I think although their solutions are probably different.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them are reporters who are just trying to, set the record straight. It should be pointed out that in all this reporting, here it is years and years after the financial collapse, nobody has gone to jail that I know of. Is that right? Is that something that
not to speak of. I mean, some minor players
Yeah.
in Iceland, everybody trumpeted the fact that they threw their bankers in jail, but they got out very quickly, and they're back, doing the same things they were doing.
Right.
So
it seems to be, financial crimes have been committed grossly. It seems like the way, for me, I guess you could say I'm a slightly above educated consumer, but I don't have a MBA or anything like that. But it seems to me that these financial institutions like Arthur Andersen and Bear Stearns and groups in that space essentially burned their own houses down through greed and overreach, and we, the American people, bailed them out.
Exactly. This is my latest article. It's a little wonky, but that the Federal Reserve has just poured a bunch of money into the repo market. You've probably seen that, right?
Can you explain what that is?
Well, okay. So banks do not really lend their depositors money. What they do is create deposits on their books. So when you go to take out a loan, they'll just write that sum into your deposit account. But when you write a check to your seller, they'll have to cover that check. And so they don't bother to borrow until that happens.
Okay.
And they've got checks coming in and going out all day. So in a good day, they'll get as many in as going out. And so they don't have to borrow at all. But if they go below their reserve requirement, then they used to always borrow from other banks on the Fed funds market. But they've quit doing that because it's actually often cheaper to borrow on the repo market, which is a market where like Fed money market funds, pension funds, and anybody with extra money it's like a pawn shop. So they'll take some sort of security, federal security, and give money overnight. So these loans are rolled over and over and over. So particularly the shadow banks go to the Fed funds market. These are like hedge funds. They're making loans for leveraged buyouts and all kinds of things that we totally don't approve of. And we, the taxpayers, because the Fed feels compelled to support this fake interest rate on its Fed funds rate, they always jump in. And so they're jumping in and pumping money into the repo market, which means these hedge funds that are doing highly speculative, damaging things, the ones that bought up all the properties after 2008 and are now renting them back to us at double the price, they are getting very cheap money from the Federal Reserve, and the rest of us aren't.
It sounds like another insider's game that, you have to master the details, but once you master, it's like printing money. Whereas we out here, we're just the dumb consumers. We just pay and pay and pay, at the retail rates. So one of the things that I think a lot of our viewers and listeners can appreciate is debt. Probably everybody watching this video and everybody they know carry debt. And, the way I think about it is like, I don't have enough money to do the thing I want to do, whether it's buy a car or even, plan for my future or build a business, expand my kitchen. There's those kinds of plans that are future oriented that require more money than I have right this minute. So I either put it on a credit card or I go someplace like a bank and I get a loan. And I understand that for the privilege of getting that money, I'm going to pay the borrower what I owe him plus profit. And so I guess a lot of people feel that way. And then there's people who just sort of carry a credit card, and even though they could pay for a cup of coffee, with cash or a pair of shoes with cash, they would prefer to pay with a credit card. and that's how they like to operate. So I think of debt in those little ways and big ways. And most people then encounter the debt through going to school, buying a car, or buying a home. And I have here an article that now says student debt is now past $1.3 trillion. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about debt and, how people encounter debt?
How we encounter debt. Well, I can talk about the solution.
We'll get to that in a minute. But I mean, people need to understand why a new solution is needed, because they're wallowing in debt, Ellen, right? And
Yeah,
I think they
totally.
don't, so that's kind of the spirit of my thought here.
Okay, well, they're wallowing in debt because the government, in its wisdom, decided to make loans available to students. And students are not, they're not real savvy. And when, so they fall for these loans that are backed by the government. And the universities know that they can pump up their tuition, which they do. They keep increasing the prices because they know that the students feel that they must get a degree, and they're willing to pay any cost. And there's this idea that once you get out, you'll get a job that allows you to pay that back. But now we see that that's not true.
Right. So we see, and I teach at the university level here in Chicago, and I'm always talking to my students about this kind of rigged game where you think you're compelled to have a degree, an advanced degree, but the job market is very precarious, and so our universities are complicit, as you say, in sending our young people out burdened with debt. Now, the thing that we really want to talk about is this concept, Ellen, of a public bank that you've been writing about. You're a crusader. We have a video that we grabbed from your own website. Are we prepared to show that? All right. So this is a little promotional video prepared by the Public Banking Institute, which Ellen founded, and she's going to tell us about in a minute, that hopefully will explain to our viewers or set up the conversation on what is a public bank.
In this city, in anywhere USA, the residents of this city have decided they want a park. The city council agrees the park is a great idea. But how will they pay for it? The city needs to borrow money. But borrowing money means the city has to pay a lot more money in interest and fees that could double the cost of the park. And that money leaves the city. It goes to Wall Street investors who really don't care about the park or the city at all. This is a bad deal for the city and its residents. There's a much better option. An option that's been proven around the world. A public bank. A public bank is a bank owned by the residents of a city, state, region, or territory. Private Wall Street banks just want to make profits for their shareholders. But public banks have a mission to serve the public good. They have to reflect the values and needs of the community. And that makes all the difference. Politicians don't run a public bank. Their job is to just set it up by listening to what the people need and want. Public banks are run by skilled local bankers who know their neighbors. Residents are on the supervising board to keep tabs on what the bank's doing. Public banks can save communities lots of money. First, they cut out expensive Wall Street fees, which can be hundreds of millions of dollars a year in a big city. Second, they can lower interest rates on the city's loans, which means there's more money to spend on other projects. Third, their profits go back to the city, not to Wall Street, so a public bank can make money for the city. All this means the people of the city have a lot more money to fund all the things they need, such as bridges, good roads, good schools, renewable energy, affordable housing, lower taxes, and the park the people wanted. They now control their own money, and they can build their own future. To find out more, go to publicbankinginstitute.org.
Okay. I love how things pop up in that video magically, like trees, the power of public money. So Ellen, can you tell us, what is a public bank?
A public bank is a bank owned by a government, so it can be a city, a state, or a federal government, any level. And it has the advantage that it takes in the government's deposits. We're particularly talking about government's deposits. You could set it up so that it takes individual deposits, and they do that in Germany. The Sparkasse banks are publicly owned, and every little village has one, and they're actually owned by the community, or they're not really owned by anybody. They're like nonprofits, not owned by anybody. And their mandate is to serve the local community. They're not allowed to lend outside their community or to work outside their community. And the Bank of North Dakota model is that the depositor is the state of North Dakota and cities if they want to.
So let me stop you for a second. So a bank, in the sense of it's a financial institution that makes loans. It does banking sort of things, but it's not owned by shareholders in the sense of people derive profit from it. Like one person could own 70% of the bank. It's owned by the people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And people always say, what's the difference between a public bank and a credit union? A credit union is owned by the customers, the depositors, but it doesn't take government deposits. It's not big enough to take government's deposits, and it's very limited in what it can do. So it can't do the things that a government bank needs to be able to do. Really, only Wall Street banks are set up for that right now.
Okay,
and
so
it's obviously not owned by the whole community. It's only owned by it's still a private bank.
Yes, it's a smaller
competing with other private banks.
Got it.
Yeah.
So it's a much bigger operation, and so the one that we talked about, in America is our only public bank at this time, and that is the Bank of North Dakota, which celebrated.
We do have a new one this year, Bank of Samoa.
Oh well, we're gonna
American Samoa.
We'll make a note of that, but the grandfather, so to speak, celebrating its 100th year this year in 2019. Can you tell us about the origin story of the Bank of North Dakota?
Yeah, well, it was another farmers' revolt in 1919. It was and then that whole decade, the farmers were suffering from their farms were getting foreclosed on by out-of-state bankers, and it turned out that the banks, the railroad, and the granary were all one cartel. And so they weren't, well, there's a couple of movies on this, and these are like Norwegian and Swedish farmers who are very, very conservative. We're going to have anything to do with any kind of socialist movement, for having a public bank or a public granary. But when they realized that they were actually being cheated by the granary, railroad, banking cartel, then they banded together, formed a party called the Nonpartisan League. Neither left nor right. It was not about that. It was about keeping our money in the state, serving.
Yeah. So
our local
let me stop you there. So there was organizing happening. It just didn't happen. And there's a guy named Arthur C. Townley, A.C. Townley. Can you tell us a little bit about this guy and his role in what you're talking about here, this organizing?
Yeah. Well, he was originally he was a socialist organizer, although he wasn't necessarily. That was his job to organize this socialist group. And they eventually, I guess, he couldn't get the farmers to mobilize under that label for starters, but they also, for some reason, fired him, I guess. And so he went on to form this nonpartisan league. But he also got the idea which was something new, they had cars then suddenly. And before that, you had to go from town to town, I guess, on a horse and buggy, which is very slow. So rented a car or borrowed a car and went from town to town. And he was just a great speaker. And that's really what it takes is, a mobilizing force, a central force that everybody gets behind and gets around.
And Ellen, you are that person for us. You are our A.C. Townley. And you're right. It takes someone, like I said at the start, an educator and a bit of an investigator, a bit of a provocateur, and someone who has the passion, as you do, to see this new thing. And it takes a lot of explaining, as you do, quite a bit. I know you do a lot of speaking and a lot of writing. So Mr. Townley helped start and organize this Nonpartisans League, which I understand caught on like wildfire. Hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands of members, right?
Yeah, and I think they were charging $6 for a membership, and the farmers all paid it, which at that time was,
It's a lot.
a fair amount of money.
Right.
And they raised the money, won an election.
So they ran candidates in North Dakota, swept all houses and all positions with their platform, and we'll show some images when we put this thing together. There'll be some images, Ellen, of from the Nonpartisan League, some of their literature and so forth, so the viewers can get a sense of the flavor. But yes, they were successful in their politics, in their policy and their politics. So the ideas led to policy, the policy led to organizing, which led to elections, and that's kind of what we have to do here. And so they started the Bank of North Dakota 100 years ago. Now, here we are 100 years later. I'm reading now from the 2018 annual report. Oh, there's A.C. Townley right now. And we just, look at him. He looks very austere, doesn't he? But in the Bank of North Dakota's annual report, this is the president, Eric Hardmeyer, is saying, I am pleased to announce that it was our 15th consecutive year of record profits, earning $159 million in 2018. The state's return on investment was a healthy 18%. So let's get this straight. The bank is doing business. They have deposits. They're lending, and they are making money. And that money is being returned to the state. Is that right?
That's right. Well, right now, the way most states do it is they send their money off to Wall Street. The Wall Street banks use that money, leverage it into loans for their own purposes. They do not direct it back to our community. So not only are we not getting the benefit of these low-cost loans, but the leveraging power of the money is going elsewhere. Like they can leverage it at 10 to 1. The capital is leveraged at 10 to 1. And we are losing that power. And so our money supply is shrinking while theirs is growing. And theirs is going into the speculative market, which you can see the stock market, it just keeps growing and growing. And everybody's remarking, well, it can't keep going up. But it can, because our money is going in there and it's not coming back.
It's not coming back.
Our
it's a one-way street.
Yeah.
And so what the farmers 100 years ago perceived through your comments, they didn't own the silos, they didn't own the railroads, they didn't own the exchanges. They just did the labor to grow the product, the wheat, the barley, the what have you, the corn, and shipping their product, and everyone else was making beaucoup money and leaving them often deep in debt.
Right.
And people were losing their farms, and they said enough is enough. And doesn't that sound like America today? Right?
Yeah, totally.
We're in that same place.
Very bifurcated, rich and poor.
So the Bank of North Dakota in 2018 had a cumulative profit of $1.8 billion and a cumulative payments to the state of North Dakota of $1 billion. So what we're saying here with this annual report is that through their business line items of lending and doing the things that a bank does, through the fees that they generate, they just take that money, they operate their offices, they pay their personnel, and then all that extra money that is in excess of their operating is returned or given to the state of North Dakota to a tune of $1 billion. Now imagine, so wherever you are watching this, think of your city or your county or state and thinking, my goodness, could it work here? Could it work here? So is this idea catching on in other places across the country, Ellen?
Well, it definitely just caught on in California. It is. We've got over 25 active bills that are filed and are being pursued by legislators in different states across the country. In California, we've got the most action, and recently a coalition was formed of advocates in 8 different cities in California to form to get passage of a bill called AB 857, which set up a special charter or set up the requirements for a publicly owned bank in California. So first of all, it made it clear that it was legal. That was some of the pushback we got, was that you can't do that. But so now we've established that you can do that, and the actual parameters for what you have to do, the steps you have to take in order to do it. And all these groups are now competing to be first. I mean, it's largely the millennials that are.
Wonderful.
Millennials have the energy, and
That's
the
great.
old timers have the. We're kind of guiding them to Sacramento.
Get out of the way, of this freight train, old people.
Yeah.
So I know there was a referendum in Los Angeles, right? That got hundreds of thousands of votes.
Yeah, a year ago, which did very well. It got 44% of the vote. We didn't win, but we only had 4 months to pursue it. No money was behind. I mean, eventually we managed to get a bit.
Yeah.
But
I think that's very
amazing,
encouraging.
right?
I think that's hugely encouraging, personally.
And that right after AB 857 was passed, the president of the city council, Herb Weston, in Los Angeles, held a press conference, and he said they were planning to pursue a city-owned bank for Los Angeles.
Wonderful.
So that's the second largest city in the country, 4 million people.
Awesome. So California has led the way over the years in all sorts of lifestyle, political, public policy, and they may lead the way here as well. And when and you know what? To me, it's a little like the cannabis. There were some people, some forward thinkers who have been advocating for justice reasons and economic reasons that drugs and cannabis particularly should be legalized. And so that's a political dialogue. But when some cities and states have done so, and I'm thinking of Colorado now, how much money is flowing into the treasury in Colorado from legalized pot, other jurisdictions are saying, wait a minute. It's a little bit of that, I feel. Do you agree?
Yeah. Well, I know other jurisdictions are waiting to see what California does, because California's big, and we do outrageous things. I mean, California does tend to be first. So
yeah, and so in my book, Chicago is Not Broke: Funding the City We Deserve, we talk about a public bank for Chicago, and we've done 77 public meetings, Ellen, all over the city, and. When I get to that point in our presentation discussing these are progressive and sustainable revenue solutions that are not regressive, they don't hit the little guy, like we do in Chicago with property taxes and plastic bag fees and soda pop tax and every darn thing you can think of here, all regressive. When I get to the point in the presentation and say, and now for my favorite idea, a public bank, there's a moment of going like, what is that? And so I put on my educator hat and, kind of have a conversation like we've just did about, who has debt here and how people feel about that. And then I introduce this idea of a bank as a public good, that it would exist to help you or a source of cheap credit. And usually somebody in the audience will offer a story about how they are deeply in debt, And unfortunately, Chicago has the most homes underwater in America. So there's usually somebody who has a story like that. So has it been your experience as you are, proselytizing and, speaking in groups that you hear stories back about something like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is what's driving the movement in California. Certainly in Los Angeles, we have a definite homeless problem and a housing crisis. People just can't afford to live here. The rents are through the roof. Yeah. And
do you think there might be a connection with this cannabis industry, which has got its own banking issues, that maybe there might be a kind of a marriage here in some way?
Yeah, well, they've definitely tried to pursue it. John Chung was the treasurer up until recently. California State Treasurer, and he spent a year and a half investigating how they could set up a cannabis bank. But the hurdles just seemed too big. The problem was that, of course, it's federally illegal, and they could come in at any time. And, even as a cannabis grower, you don't necessarily want to put your money in a bank where it might get confiscated at some point.
Exactly.
So everybody's waiting on the feds.
We're
to
waiting
change
on the
law.
feds.
But
Yeah.
that did definitely stimulate interest. Everybody was interested in that. The government was interested in that. They wanted that tax money. They were going to get something like, I've forgotten now, but was it $7 billion? They were expecting a $7 billion business, and they
Wow.
would get something like $1 billion.
Well, all right. So I'm going to be bold and make a prediction that, you know, the confluence of events and interests of organizers and politicians are coming together here. The time is right, obviously, for both the continuing legalization of cannabis and the practices around it, and the advent of the public bank. And I think somehow they're going to have some kind of congruency. That's how I look at it. You know, the time is right.
There's revolutions going on everywhere. The people are certainly not happy.
No.
And all we have to do, what we need to do is catalyze everybody in the same direction.
Okay.
It seems to me people are ready to move. They're very discontented, but it's like with the 1919 movement, you've got to get everybody thinking in the same direction. So we've got the numbers, we've got the power if we can get everybody on the same page. And so that's, of course, what I do is write and try and, you're always up against, first of all, you're up against the other, I shouldn't say against, but anyway, you've got to argue with the other money reformers because they will have some other solution. Mm-hmm. And then there's the fact that not everybody even recognizes that banking is the problem. So you have to show them, right, or show that underlies all our problems in all these different groups. Everybody needs funding, and why don't they have the funding?
You know, the Watergate investigator, Deep Throat, said to the reporters, "Follow the money." So, to me, unless we have a thorough understanding and mastery of money and resources, we're never going to get anywhere in this country. Who has the money? Who gets the money? Who makes the money? It's at the heart of my work. So you run the Public Banking Institute, and briefly, can you tell us about that before we have to sign off?
Okay. Our goal, we're a 501c3, so we're not actually allowed to lobby, but our goal is to help activists get public banks set up and to inform legislators and to just get this idea out there and to mobilize people and, like I was saying, kind of get everybody to understand the problem. And for me particularly, I just write.
Well, everybody who's out there who's interested, we send you to publicbankinginstitute.org. We'll have that link on our YouTube space when we pull all this together. Our guest tonight has been Ellen Brown, author, educator, provocateur, and expert in public banking, a real pioneer, and you have my deep admiration, Ellen, and thank you so much for coming on the CivicLab show.
Thank you, and thanks for all your work. It sounds great. Okay.
We'll be talking.
Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our show, the CivicLab show. So we have a few requests of you. If you like what you see, please do subscribe to the CivicLab at our YouTube channel. And that's at tinyurl.com/CivicLab-videos. We'll have that URL for you. Please do subscribe. Please join our campaign to abolish the racist tax increment financing program, TIFs, at endtifsnow.org. Until next week, this is Tom Tresser, civic educator, public defender at the CivicLab, saying, go out and start something.